This is a physics colloquium. We're very lucky to have Eric Hudson from UCLA, who braved the 110 on a weekday to join us to tell us about some very exciting recent results. Eric works on a very broad range of AMO physics. He's worked with atoms, molecules, nuclei, neutrals, ions, crystals, and done research in a very broad range from fundamental chemistry to quantum information to molecular control and cooling, and now recently studying nuclei using lasers. Eric did his PhD with Junyi and then a postdoc with Dave DeMille before moving to UCLA to start his own group. He's the recipient of the NSF Career Award and Presidential Early Career in Science and Engineering Award, and is a fellow of the American Physical Society. And I'm very excited to hear this actually very interesting story, not just scientific result. I think the story of how this came to be is really interesting. So I'm looking forward to hearing about it. I hope you are too. Let's welcome Eric.
Thank you guys for having me. We're gonna stand.
We're voting on that. So.
That's okay. Is that okay? Am I in your way? I can stand behind. Well, no, that I can't see it. Okay. Well, thank you for having me. It's really fun to talk about this work. It's been. Yeah, what was it? Okay, all right. I can't move over here. Yeah. All right. This is as Nick alluded to, been really a passion project in my lab for a number of years. I started thinking about this in 2007, 2008. So it's been a while. It's not the main thing we've been doing, but it was always in the corner of the lab, hoping that someday when this would work. And if you can't tell, this talk is just as much a talk to you as sort of a therapy session for me about the 16 years. And so that crazy dream was, can we do laser spectroscopy of a nucleus? The outline for the talk is here. I'll start off by setting the stage. And the answer is that, the beginning of this starts almost 50 years ago, actually, in 1976. A couple of guys realized that there was a state in thorium-229 that maybe was low enough in energy in the nucleus that you could excite it with a laser. And that touched off, decades of work trying to find the state and actually excite it with a laser. I'll talk about our contribution to that dream, which was this idea that you could dope thorium into these high bandgap crystals and still be able to access this nuclear transition while having lots and lots of nuclei to make it easier to find it. I'll touch just briefly on a couple of things we did along the way that would be important to what's to come next. And then I hope to answer this question, which is a question I've been asked at Daymont by everyone for the last 15 years.
Can you share the screen, please?
So our work was funded by NSF, Army, and DARPA, and we're really grateful for that. Okay, so before I start, I just want to say a little bit about what my group does, one slide, and then before I get into the thorium bit. So there's 4 projects, they're pretty diverse. On one end, the most sort of speculative, crazy dreaming project is this idea of sometimes called chemically assembled quantum hardware. In a word, the dream is, what is the limit of nanofabrication? We push it all the way down. It's chemistry. It's assembling a device atom by atom. And so what if you were to look at building things with chemistry that were useful? And here I mean things like qubits or quantum sensors. And so we've been working with a bunch of quantum chemists, Wes Campbell, who many of you may know, designing things that we call quantum functional groups and putting them on surfaces and seeing what they do. It's pretty exciting, a lot of fun. I also do work in trapped ion quantum computing with Wes Campbell. This is really not so much about building the best quantum computer, but what are the fundamental limits to the gates that you can affect? Are there more efficient ways of encoding information to make it more robust? Sort of maybe the fundamentals of quantum computing. The largest part of my group historically has been working on getting molecules under control as qubits, quantum sensors. The idea being that they are very much like atoms in that you expect long coherence times and, nice performance, but they have many more internal states. And therefore there's more advantages, more opportunities for sensing or encoding information. And then the fourth thing, which I'll talk about today, is this project that we refer to as the nuclear clock project. Okay. All right, so we're going to be talking about nuclear structure. Let's quickly review electronic structure before jumping into nuclear structure. So this is the ChatGPT picture of an atom. You'll notice there are 3 flavors of electrons somehow, but it was easier than doing a Google search. So if we think about electronic structure, we all know what the potential is, 1 over R. Protons attract the electrons repel each other. You could solve this problem. You get these beautiful, well-defined energy states with quantum numbers that make sense to us. And we can think about how orbitals or these shells fill according to a Pauli exclusion principle. And we can explain all the periodic table and chemistry and most of our everyday experience. For the nuclear structure, the situation is a little more complicated. You first get to what is the potential here? Well, we know the strong force is involved. We know the Coulomb force is involved. And so let's talk about how we think about this. But what we know already is that underneath this is a bunch of fermions, 2 types now, that are bound together. And so we expect that there's going to be quantum numbers and energy levels and all of that. And so let's just try to get a little intuition about that. So we can start by writing down the Hamiltonian. And let me stop here and say, if you're a nuclear physicist or know nuclear structure, I apologize profusely for what I'm about to say. If you're not, this is perfectly correct. Right. So there's some Hamiltonian. We know that these nucleons have kinetic energy. We know there's potential between them. We know sort of what goes into it. But this is going to be too hard for us to handle. And so we say, let's make some approximations. At the first order, we know that the range of the nuclear force is about the size of, say, a lithium or a beryllium nucleus. And you can tell this because if you look at the binding energy per nuclei per nucleon of nuclei, it sort of saturates around there. So that's about the range of the force. And so that says, why don't we try some sort of mean field approach? Because I'm going to be talking about heavy nuclei where they're much bigger than this radius. And we say, well, let's just assume that, and we'll think probably mostly about the valence nucleon in a minute, but there's some mean field that describes the binding potential of the nucleus. Now, and over here we'll have some bit, which is the difference between that mean field and the true potential. We'll call that residual interaction, and we can come back to that. All right. So then we have this mean field picture, and we say, let's look at sort of our valence nucleon and see what does he see when he looks out. And we really don't know what that mean field potential should be. There are different models. One that works surprisingly well for these heavy nuclei is to say, it's probably a harmonic oscillator, right? Now, we know that that's unphysical because the interaction potential doesn't extend to infinity. But, as a phenomenology, as a model, I can't say that much. I'm looking on this part. You could just sort of put this omega to get there. Now, we can't forget this residual interaction at the moment. What happens here in heavy nuclei is that the details of the nuclear force mean that you don't actually feel these orbitals in the way we're used to in atomic physics. You kind of feel them unequally for the different projections of spin. And so what you get is not a nucleus that this valence nucleon doesn't see a sort of spherical core that it interacts with. It sees something that's deformed because of this residual interaction. And we can account for that by just saying, okay, we'll have now a deformed harmonic oscillator potential. And so we can use this to sort of describe this nucleus. Then we say, of course, well, this nucleon has spin, so there's some spin-orbit interaction here. I use lambda and sigma because this is no longer spherical. This is, say, cylindrical quantum numbers. So if you know molecular spectroscopy, like many of you do, this, is like some maybe Hund's casing or something. All right. There's another connection we have to think about, which is that the nuclear force, again, is very, very short range. And so this harmonic oscillator is not really a great approximation. Because when the nucleon is kind of here in the middle, there's as much, nuclear matter over here as over here, and it really doesn't feel any force. So we need something that's flatter. And we can get there by adding what is called the orbit-orbit interaction. It's basically just a correction that scales as angular momentum squared, because the bigger L is, the more time you spend out here. And it effectively flattens out this potential. So this is, a whole description of what's known as the Nielsen model. And we have these well-defined quantum numbers here, where this K is the co-projection of the angular momentum onto the symmetry axis. And these are things like the principal quantum number and its projection of the harmonic oscillator. And that's the orbital angular momentum. Okay. Now, you can see that this situation, if you compare it to, say, atomic or molecular physics, is maybe not as nice, is a nice way to say it. Like, in atomic molecular physics, we know, we have like a perfect description of everything. We can write down the actual potentials and solve it. Well, nuclear physics gives up on that ring and that side of the coin. It gets back at another, which is to go take that molecular spectroscopy, that atomic spectroscopy. We have to come in with lasers and find these states and a whole thing. In nuclear physics, you get the energy levels for free, basically, because of radioactive decay. And I'll show you how that's done. And I'll do this using the example of the experiment that led to the topic of today's talk. So in 1976, Kroger and Reich at the Idaho lab were looking at the gamma rays that come off when uranium-233 decays. So uranium-233 decays by alpha decay, and it becomes a 229 thorium nucleus. Now, if you think about the nucleons inside of this nucleus, they were perfectly happy sitting in the ground state of uranium. And then, a moment later, they suddenly realize, hey, this isn't uranium anymore. We're in not the right configuration. And so what do? They emit gamma rays as they relax back down to the ground state. And so gamma rays come off, and all you have to do is collect these gamma rays, measure their energies, and you get all the emission of the nucleus so that you can piece back together its energy. And so Kroger and Reich did this, and what they found with some refinements over the years is shown. So this is the ground state of the nucleus. It's an I/5/2 angular momentum. On top of this is what we call a rotational band. This is literally the nucleus rotating because it's it's not spherically symmetric. Over here we have another state where I is 3/2. And the way to think about this, the way I like to think about it, is let's think about that valence neutron. It sees this deformed core. It has some total angular momentum projection onto the symmetry axis of 5/2. These are just the rotational states of that. This other state is just the other spin orbit state where this projection is 3/2 on here. And then it has some rotational band on top of it. Now you might say, aha, this makes perfect sense. Well, actually, what I haven't told you yet, sorry, is that this energy is very, very low compared to what you would expect for nuclear physics. Right, so this is in keV. This is sort of the normal scale of heavy nuclei, energy levels separated by 40 keV. This band head here starts only, at the time it was thought, about 3 eV above the ground state. This is, wholly unique in all the known nuclei, right? All the other nuclei are keV or higher, right? So it's 1,000 times smaller. You might say, okay, this makes sense because this is a spin orbit splitting, and okay, spin orbit in atoms is small, but in a nucleus, maybe it's a few eV. It turns out that spin orbit in a nucleus is in the eV or more. And so this isn't at all like just spin orbit. This is as near as I can tell, and this is one of my goals over my life, is to understand why this is true. As near as I can tell, it's completely accidental. That nature just no one knows of any symmetry that can produce this, and it just sort of, that's just this universe, that's the way this happened. There's some magic cancellation of the strong and the Coulomb force that makes this energy not that different than this, at like a part per billion kind of level. Now, what happened then was, after this experiment, everybody said, oh my God, we have a nucleus that we could laser excite, that would be cool, let's go look for this state. We want to see the photon come from the state, or better yet, drive it there. People looked for decades, thought they found it and realized they didn't. And after some time, in 2007, there's a measurement done by Livermore in collaboration with NASA Goddard and Los Alamos that redid this measurement with modern tools and said, hey, it's not 3 eV actually, it's about 8 eV. Now, for a nuclear physicist, that's no big deal. I mean, you see these other numbers, they don't even put that third decimal place, right? But if you're an atomic physicist who is looking for this, this is a big deal. Because 8 eV is like, I don't know, it's a vacuum ultraviolet photon. It doesn't propagate in air. 3.5 eV is a UV photon. That's fine. So every experiment that ever looked for this could have never seen it because the photons wouldn't have propagated. And so that sort of re-energized the community to go look for this. And this is when I got involved, this is when this paper came out. All right, so why do people care? All right, that's the history of thorium. Why do people care? If you give atomic physicists two numbers, which are the frequency and the line length of something, the first thing they do is calculate the Q. And you calculate the Q of this resonator, and you say, oh, that's really high. Could I build a clock? Right? This is higher than, atomic clocks, ion clocks, neutral clocks. And so it looks attractive, right? It's not like dramatically higher, but it's higher. But the real reason you would want to build a nuclear clock are the systematics, I think. Because this is a nucleus, the moments, the electromagnetic moments are really small. You have nuclear magnetons, right? Nuclear electric quadrupole moments. So the environmental shifts are going to be very small. There's also, you don't really have to worry about black body radiation because the first E1 transitions at 40 keV. Like if you have 40 keV black body, you have other problems. Right? And so this could be a really accurate clock. And so probably the first person to really point this out, who sometimes gets overlooked, is Eugene Tokaria in Moscow in 1996. As usual, the Russians did it first. But probably one of the more important papers, if not the most, was this Pike and Tam paper from 2003, where they really looked at this and said, hey, you can build a clock of pretty exciting performance here. Then later in 2012, Andrei Derivienko with Alex Kuzmich said, using sort of what we know about atomic physics and clocks since 2003, showed in a very serious way you could build a clock of at the time, unbelievable performance. Our contribution was this idea of not building an iron clock, which is what most of these guys were thinking about, but really to take a page out of Mossbauer spectroscopy, which was that you could take this nucleus, dope it into a solid, and if the band gap was high enough, you could still get this photon in, and the nucleus doesn't care. Right? If it's in a solid or a gas, it just looks out and sees electrons far away. And the transition isn't quenched by the electrons, like an electronic transition would be when you put it in a solid. And this sort of led to this dream that, well, the truth is, the way this idea came up is I was trying to figure out how do we find this transition? Because as you'll see in a moment, like the energy that it was known to was not that great, and we know it's very narrow. And the idea was, well, if we could build it into a solid, we could get a lot of them there and maybe find it. And in analyzing the systematics of this, realized that it could also be a pretty good clock. It could outperform, say, the cesium standard in just this little crystal. And so the dream was that you could take this sort of lab-sized apparatus that keeps time for the nation and reduce it to this crystal that you could just hold this thorium for you. But as I said, the real reason was to solve this problem that I call the needle in the haystack problem. And the needle is the fact that the line length of this transition is exceedingly narrow. It wasn't known, but we knew it was of order of millihertz or not. And the haystack was that the nuclear physics measurement said somewhere between 140 and 180 nanometers that you have to search for. So this is a really painful haystack. It's more of a briar patch because you don't have good laser technology here, and this is a very hard thing. But with these crystals, the dream was that you could take a VUV beam and just simply collect the nuclear fluorescence. And the numbers look so good when you run them, and you don't need to look at that, that it looked like you could use the ALS. The ALS is an advanced light synchrotron up at Berkeley. And so that is something that could tune over this whole range. And so when we thought of this experiment, we realized we could search the whole range in like 4 or 5 days up at the ALS. And so this is how we were going to find the transition. So that's what we set off to do. There were some There was some heavy lifting along the way. The first was that we needed this crystal with some pretty remarkable properties. It had to accept thorium as a dopant. Thorium is very big, it doesn't like to go anything. It's got to have a high band gap, and it needs to be radiation resistant because this thorium-229 is actually kind of radioactive. It's about an 8,000 year half-life. We worked for a number of years to try to figure those out. The second challenge was that we needed a few milligrams of this. The very first quote we got was $6 million. Luckily, they gave us 60 days to think it over. But so this was, not quite unobtainable, but like pretty hard. So we nonetheless worked on this for a number of years, and then after about 5 years, we were able to get the thorium with a lot of help from Oak Ridge, and then grow crystals that incorporated the thorium into them. The crystal we use is lithium, strontium, aluminum fluoride. The choice is it's a very high band gap crystal, greater than 10 eV. It also has some of the lowest radiation-induced fluorescence of any material that we surveyed. And it's important here to thank the people who are critical to this, because this was a crazy project over a number of years. Syed Mirza was a radiochemist at Oak Ridge National Lab. Over the years, he very brilliantly, whenever he could, would extract thorium-229 from uranium that was laying around and hide it and wait for the right opportunity to come by, because he knew it would be important. And then Hans Jensen, who's just a wizard at crystal growth, there's just no way we could have done this in this amount of time without him. So we got our first crystals. The moment we got them out of the oven, right, we send them to the polisher. They're basically still warm, and we get them polished up and drop them in a FedEx envelope and ship them straight to the ALS.
The crystals themselves, they're not radioactive. Right?
No, they're reasonably radioactive, microcurie kind of level.
Did you tell FedEx?
We did tell FedEx, yes. FedEx will ship anything for enough money, is what I have learned. I'm sure that there are a lot of cartels that know that. Yeah, and they will ship it quickly. It's actually funny that I wasn't going to tell a story, but you brought it up. So we were worried about this, right? Because we haven't made these crystals, like no one had made crystals like this before. We're like, I don't know, are they gonna like fall apart in like a day? Like, we better do this measurement. So we ship them straight to the ALS, but of course they have to go, it's a DOE lab, so they have to go to the DOE receiving people who like check the radioactivity, make sure that you know what you're doing because you're an idiot, right? And they're not. And so we also had a crystal that had thorium-232 in it, which is thorium, should be chemically very similar, but it doesn't have the nuclear transition. And so that was going to be our control measurement, because I don't know, you shoot VUV light into a crystal, it's probably going to glow, right? And so we're getting ready to do the run and put the crystal in. And something just in the back of my mind started like bugging me. I was like, what do you think the probability is that when they put the crystals back in the box, they put them in the right box? Because you can't tell the difference. One has the right nucleus, one has the other nucleus. And my grad students were pretty mad at me. Like, it's late, dude, just put it in, let's get it going. I kind of held my ground and said, no, we got to figure this out. And so they spent like an hour walking around the ring, just asking people if they had a Geiger counter. We come back, and sure enough, they had switched the crystals. But that turned out to not matter because we didn't see but it almost mattered. I was going to tell that story, but I told it anyway, so it doesn't matter. So here's how it worked. The ALS beam comes in here. This was our experiment. We just bolted on. There's a chamber here where the crystal's held. There's some shutters so we can excite the nuclei. There's some PMTs inside to see fluorescence. It's a very simple experiment conceptually. And so here's the result. We didn't see anything. This is what we call our exclusion plot. This was the possible transition energy. This is it in wavelength and the sort of possible lifetime. And the blue region is something we worked with Takalia to sort of mine the nuclear physics data to predict where the transition should be with about 90% confidence. And so we excluded what's shown in red. So we excluded a lot of it, but not all of it. And what we were limited by was the tunability of the ALS. We couldn't check this region, and also the flux. It makes a lot of photons, but these synchrotrons are pretty broadband, and so you're driving a narrow transition, and you pay a price for that, like the ratio of the line widths. And so what we did was said, well, I guess we have to build that laser anyway. Our original plan was to find one in the synchrotron, then build the laser, but we said, I guess we have to do the laser search. So we went back to UCLA, and we built a VUV laser that was tunable. It was about, at a spectral radiance number, it's about 20,000 times brighter than the synchrotron. The way it works is it's a couple of pulse dye lasers. They get mixed in xenon, and we do four-wave mixing. There's some VUV, the VUV beam comes here, and then this is just the same thing you saw on the ALS chamber, or ALS beam line, just the crystal with the PMTs. The challenge with this, and this is where the pain came in, was that because this is such a narrow source, we knew we'd have to scan for about 3 years to cover the whole range. And that's running most of the time. So this experiment really had to be automated and sort of self-correcting. And I want to give a ton of credit to Christian Schneider, who's now at JPL, Justin Jeet, who's now at Lawrence Livermore, for tackling this problem. They had to solve so many problems, things like, it turned out like just measuring the power in VUV of a pulse. Like you could we bought a detector and it measured negative energy because they've never actually used it and hadn't thought about photoelectrons coming off. So we had all sorts of custom things they solved. They had to figure out how to monitor the mode spectrum of this pulse dye laser, which is kind of nasty for every shot because, you know, you're scanning over this range and, okay, you hit it at 3 a.m. at night and your laser goes multi-mode and you miss it, right? And you never know. And so this was a pretty heroic effort by these guys. It was complicated by the fact that everyone thought this was crazy, and so it wasn't well funded. For those of you that have been around a while, you might know what these orange boxes are. If you haven't, let me show you that this thing was manufactured in West Germany. So they were not new lasers. But, you know, nonetheless, through Christian and Justin's just sheer will, they made it happen. And so for about 3 years, every hour, we get an email from the experiment. And it looked like this. You don't really, this is just stuff about what was the wavelength, what was the power, was the spectrum okay? And then the main graph is this one, which is how many photons you saw as a function of time. And what you hope to see here is a big decaying exponential showing that you've excited the nucleus. Right? So we scanned for about those 3 years and we saw nothing. And if you believe that, if you take that data and turn it into exclusion, it's what's shown in black here. And so it really pushed this way up and also killed this region over here. So we were pretty discouraged at this point because we put a lot of work into this and came up empty. But this is an exclusion based on looking at the total number of photons that came out with a very long lifetime. And we expect the transition to be something like 1,000-second lifetime, right? If our data did see something though, if instead we said, how many photons do we see come out in the first, say, 50 seconds, not first 2,000 seconds, right? We saw a little something. And here's what the short lifetime fluorescence looked like. From 184 down to about 160 nanometers, we really measured nothing. So this is like 1.5 years, 2 years of just zero everywhere. Then we see a little bump around 8 EV. We put in our, this red is a thorium-232 crystal. So it's the same crystal chemically, hopefully, but it doesn't have the nuclear transition. And it also has this. So maybe this is associated with some thorium defect or something. Right? That's not crazy based on DFT or impurities or something, who knows. But then when we scanned down near around 8.3 EV, the fluorescence really just started going up and up and up until we just really couldn't go any bluer with our laser. We put in another 229 crystal and we see something very similar. But our 232 crystal doesn't show anything really above background there. And so we started worrying that maybe this was a nuclear transition, but it was being quenched by the crystal. because this was kind of a crazy idea to begin with. Let's just put this thing, in a crystal and hope this works. And so we started working with Anastasia Alexandrova, who's an amazing quantum chemist at UCLA, and her postdoc Harry. And they did some, to me, just incredibly impressive calculations. This is DFT calculation on, this is the number of unit cells of Lysop with this crystal. It's 4 by 4 by 2. And this is one atom replaced with thorium. The reason we have to do such a big cell is these DFTs have periodic boundary conditions. And if you just use one unit cell, then there's just thorium everywhere in that. And that doesn't really reproduce the right density of states, right? So you kind of want it to be like a one thorium atom in a sea of the crystal. It's like, it was like 10 billion electrons in this calculation. It's like very hard. So they did this and they produced this graph, which is the density of electronic states in this crystal projected onto thorium orbitals. It's called projected density of states. You can think of this as the electronic states kind of near the nucleus. As shorthand. And so you see, here's the valence band. There's some states down here. This is the character they have. Here's the conduction band. And this 8.3 signal, the EV signal that we see is right where this dashed line is. And then underneath this set these defect states. And these are defects associated with doping the thorium into the crystal. The crystal has to rearrange to accept it. And so you end up with some electronic states here. Kind of like, like an NV center, like when you have a nitrogen vacancy, there's some defect states there. And so we started worrying that could this be what's quenching this? So we were working with a longtime collaborator, Andrei Derivienko, and his postdoc, Bao, who did a lot of heavy lifting on this. And the sort of picture we came up with was like, well, it's not really true that the electrons in the nuclei don't know about each other. They do interact. I mean, that's a hyperfine interaction. So the hyperfine mediates some coupling between them. And perhaps what that could do is, suppose we excite the nucleus. It's sitting here, 8-ish EV. What it can do is give its energy to an electron. And if it takes an electron from below the band head here, it can resonantly excite it to a defect state. And so then we have a defect hole pair. That hole will quickly relax because it can create phonons. And so if this is true, we should see some redshifted fluorescence. And DFT says that's about 180 nanometers if this is quenching. So Ricky and James went and looked for this. They did some spectroscopy on this emitted photon. And what they found is shown here. So this is the wavelength of the light, and this is the signal. And just look at the blue part. This background over here comes from just the radioluminescence of the crystal. This we already knew about. When you dope radioactive things in crystals, they glow. This one glows red of 225 nanometers. So it was nice that they reproduced that. But they also saw this narrow peak right around this 180 nanometer prediction. And so we were really concerned that, hey, okay, this will just never work. Because anytime you dope a thorium into this thing, there's going to be a defect state underneath this isomer energy. It's just sort of the way chemistry is going to work out. This is always going to be quenched. So we started then working on other things. And those other things came about thanks to Peter Thyroff's group in Munich, who did some important experiments. And one of them is shown here. They had some uranium-233, one plate. This thing, when uranium alpha decays, it would eject some thorium-229 because it's a very thin coating. That thorium-229 would then get guided to that quadruple mass separator and then softly landed on an MCP detector. So when this thing comes off the uranium, it comes off as an ion, like a 2 or 3 or 4 plus charge state, because when this nuclei screams out of the material, like electrons get stripped off like mad. But when it lands on this MCP, it gets neutralized. And what happens when you have a neutral thorium is the nuclear energy is greater than the ionization energy of the atom. And so it can give its energy to the electron, and the electron just flies off, and the nucleus relaxes. It's a non-radiative relaxation process. It's called internal conversion. And it takes, in the case of thorium, about 10 microseconds. And so Peter saw this, and it was really proof that this nuclear state existed. And so we sort of pivoted to doing some IC-based measurements. And I just showed this now because it'll be important later. We did two things. One is we looked on trying to excite this thorium in a metal. It's not quite metal, it's more thorium oxide. But you shine a laser into this thing, excite the nucleus, and then look for these electrons coming off. And another was work with Simon Naum and Galen O'Neill at NIST using superconducting nanowire single photon imagers to look for this. And so we had been doing that for a couple of years, and then early last year, something really important happened, and it was this paper. So Pete Van Duplen at Leuven University did a crazy experiment. It was so crazy that I know people who were invited to work on it and said, no, and they're all crazy people. That's pretty crazy, no thanks. But it worked. As you can tell by the nature. This is a super important experiment. So what they did, they were all solid at CERN. They were implanting actinium-229 into, say, magnesium fluoride, calcium fluoride, things like our crystal, this high band gap insulator. The actinium-229 beta decays into thorium-229. And when it does, it has a pretty high chance of populating this excited nuclear state that we've all been looking for. And so they just took that thing, put it in front of a spectrometer, and looked for photons. Now that sounds reasonable, and you may say, okay, why is that crazy? Well, it's crazy because for like a decade, people have been doing this, but they were always using uranium. And Pete's idea was that actinium beta decays. Beta decay is much gentler on the crystal than this alpha decay. Alpha decay wrecks the crystal, beta decay maybe not. And that was the key. Because what Pete saw was a little bump around 150 nanometers. And this appeared to be from the thorium-229. The control experiments that would have produced it didn't. You can never be sure, but it was pretty convincing evidence to everyone that, hey, so they did two things. They narrowed the search region down to a few nanometers, because this is a few nanometers wide. And most importantly to us, they proved that they had a very long lifetime. The lifetime of this excited state, this nuclear fluorescence, was like 1,000 seconds, which is what we've been looking for. Now, this is interesting because right when they had this 150 nanometers, that's right when we saw this turn on. And so we thought, well, if it's working in calcium fluoride, why isn't it working in LISAF? Maybe calcium fluoride has a better symmetries, like maybe there's something about electric field gradient mixing. We don't really know why we didn't see it. Luckily, Peter Thiokro mentioned earlier is also part of this. He's a friend of ours, and he was visiting us last summer, right after this paper came out. I said, Peter, take some of this. We literally put it in his pocket. He just put it in his carry-on luggage. It wasn't doped with radioactivity. Said, when you get back, make Pete put this in the beam line and see if they see anything. And Pete was super cool and did. And so, like, literally a few months later, Sandro, the lead grad student, called us and said, guys, this works. We totally see this long lifetime transition. But there was one important thing, but probably not all of the thorium that should have emitted did emit. And it's hard to calibrate exactly what your detection efficiency is and all that. But it looked like maybe only a few percent, the signal is only a few percent of what you would expect. So, I don't know if you've noticed, but in all these exclusion graphs I've shown, I always put, this assumes all the thorium participates. So if it's only 1%, this drops by like 2 orders of magnitude, and we've excluded very little. And so we said, okay, let's go back and look at our data. Let's statistics be damned, and just say, how many photons did we see at each wavelength over this range where Pete saw this fluorescence? And if you zoom in, so Pete's range is this gray box here. If you zoom in over this and you say, how many photons did we see in the first, say, 2,000 seconds? This is just like a scatter plot. Here's a mean, and these are just drawing the standard deviations. We said, okay, it's not like, just within the group, like 2 sigma and above is probably interesting. So let's check these points first. And when we checked this point, which was the largest of the 5, we saw a tiny little peak that was very, very narrow. It's only a few gigahertz wide. That's the alignment of our laser, right? So not a few nanometers, a few gigahertz. Then we said, okay, let's put in that 232 doped thorium crystal. And we saw nothing over this range. That's kind of exciting. Then we said, okay, well, we have another crystal on the shelf. We had several more. They all had less thorium in them, so we weren't using them. So let's just pick one of those and use it. We put it in, this guy had less thorium in it, and we saw this. Which was a difficult moment for me to process. Because if we had chosen this crystal, or in fact, of the four, if we had chosen anyone besides the one that we chose, we would have found it in like 4 years ago. The crystal that we chose, only 1% of the thorium participated. In the crystal, all the others, it's at least 50%, maybe 100. It's kind of at the level factor of 2. It's kind of hard to know your efficiency. Yeah. So, but nonetheless, this is really exciting now because we have something that could be the nuclear transition. So we can measure like brainbusters, the frequency of this transition. We immediately went from nanometer wide error bars to, this is 500 megahertz error bars. We can measure the lifetime of the state as about 600 seconds, just about what you would expect. I've been saying that the lifetime is thousands of seconds, but that's in vacuum. In the crystal, there's an index of refraction, so the photon density states is n cubed higher. It's a magnetic dipole transition. The magnetic dipole isn't screened, so it just goes as n cubed. So if you see 600 seconds here, that means in vacuum it's about 2,000 seconds, which is what we had expected in our work. And excitingly, you could probably also know that Eckert Pike and Thurston Schoen first made the crystals. Eckert did the measurement. Their paper was actually published a few weeks before ours. They saw the same transition. We measured 2024 of 7.3. They measured 409 with a 7 gigahertz error bar. So this is pretty much agreement, I would say. They see they see a slightly different lifetime, but that's expected because the index of refraction of these two materials is different. In fact, they're using calcium fluoride, I should say, and that index is actually known pretty well, like NIST measures that. For our crystal, like no one's actually done an accurate measurement of the index. We're working on that now with NIST. So these look pretty consistent with what's expected. And we may know that actually it's kind of a very weird month for thorium. At the same time, there was a result from Tokyo and Yamaguchi, who's works with Katori, did a trapped ion measurement. They didn't excite the nucleus. They basically took the experiment I showed you earlier from Peter Thyrolf and put an ion trap at the end instead of an MCP. And they just looked to see, you can take spectroscopy of the thorium, and when the excited state decays, the hyperfine changes. And so you can get a rough estimate of the lifetime. It's a pretty big error bar, but it's all in the same time. So finally, after 16, 17 years, can we say we found the thorium-229 transition? I think for a lot of people, you might say, well, you don't see it in 232, you see it in 229, that's enough. Because they're chemically identical. It's not really true. Thorium-232's half-life is like the age of the universe, whereas 229 is like 8,000 years. And so these crystals are chemically pretty different because that radioactivity has just been sitting there doing stuff to the crystal, right? But the fact that you see it at the same frequency in both LISAP and calcium fluoride, two different hosts, any color centers you create, they can't get the same frequency. And also that they're so narrow. I mean, it's hard to get a color center this narrow. Our stuff is at room temperature. Means that you can finally say, this is, I think, the nuclear transition. Now, it's kind of funny how quickly you go from celebrating to, okay, what's next? Now the next question is, what is the line width in these crystals? We predicted years ago that it could be sub-kilohertz to maybe 10 kilohertz. That's really important for applications of this thing. June Yee's group has a VUV frequency cone. They took the crystals from Vienna, these calcium fluoride crystals, and measured it with their VUV frequency cone. Once you know where the transition is, you can now use the cone to find it. And what they see was the hyperfine structure of the nucleus, right? So the crystal has an electric field gradient. These nuclei have electric quadrupole moments. And so the nuclear states are split by the electric field gradient. We expect 5, actually 6 transitions when you go through the math. And they see the 5 main ones. And the line width that they see is a few hundred kilohertz, which, okay, that's not a color center anymore, for sure. It also has the right structure. And they think that 200 kilohertz has actually been a laser, not the nucleus. So we don't actually know what the line width of this in the crystals is yet. I was putting this up just as a therapy a little bit. So when I was a postdoc with Dave DeMills, when I had this idea, and he's a great advisor. He said, I have some money I'm not spending here. You can have it and go do some stuff. And so I spent some time working on this. This was a poster at ICAP 2008. And in this poster, I drew this stick and said, this is what we'll see someday. And you know, the July 20th to September 5th isn't too bad, but 2008 to 2024 was a lot longer than I thought it would take. All right, so that's the story of the nuclear transition. Let me now tell you a little bit about where things are going, and it's pretty fun. You know, we'd like to optimize these crystals, right? Evidently, there is some quenching that can happen in these crystals for whatever reason. We have ideas about why. We'd like to figure out how to make that go away. We'd like to make the doping better, lots of things. But, you know, growing these crystals is a very long development cycle. It takes years to perfect it, and when you go test it, we find out if it works or not. So we're doing a couple of things. One is we're being really nice to Pete, and he can take crystals, put them in his beamline, and basically we can see if we see a signal from them, some fluorescence from the nuclear transition. And if we do, that's probably going to work. That's kind of like our test right now. We put things in that we know shouldn't work, and we have chemistry reasons why, and they don't work. So we're slowly building up some, you know, design principles here. But it would be nice if you didn't really have to dope into a crystal. If the thing you wanted to put in was native to that crystal anyway, then you don't get states within the band, and that's got to be helpful. So you immediately think of thorium fluoride. We had always wanted to use this, but if you go to like the materials project, you pull it up, it'll tell you that the band gap is 6.5 eV. So that's well below the nuclear state. We can't use it. We can't get the light in, the nucleus will be quenched. It'll make a conduction electron, it'll never work. But a couple of years ago, mostly led by Richard Martin, from what I can tell, at least that was the initial idea, was that thorium fluoride was re-examined. And it was found that the band gap isn't 6.5 eV, it's 10 eV, which is a huge difference, and it means this could work for us. This would be wonderful because thorium isn't a defect in this, right? It's easy to dope. And if you remember, it's a fairly standard optical coating. I'll come back to that in a minute. So we were very fortunate that we had been doing this IC search, or this thorium metal search that I mentioned earlier. What we were doing here was coating thorium, other people were doing it. We were coating thorium onto substrates, like thorium oxide, thorium oxide at the time. And then that's what we were using as our target. So Lars von der Winzer, who was in Peter's group, went and did a postdoc with June. And Lars said they were also working on this with us, that these samples that we're getting, they're just never going to work. They're not good enough. We need to learn to make our own samples. And so he built up in June's at Gilla, this physical vapor deposition system that could deposit a super radioactive thorium on the substrates. And so once we had found a nuclear transition, we talked to these guys. Falcone, who's the grad student who I'll mention in a minute, made some samples for us, just coating both sapphire and magnesium fluoride with thorium fluoride. It's a thin film, probably. It's probably not a single crystal, but just like evaporate some thorium fluoride on this. And as you alluded to, FedEx will ship anything. And 24 hours later, we had this at our lab at UCLA. Ricky and James took it, put the laser in. This is supposed to be the substrate. This is the thorium fluoride. Looked at the photons, and they saw the nuclear transition, which was cool, but kind of infuriating because we spent years learning how to grow crystals, and now you could just like throw some crap on a slide and see the nuclear transition. There's a few things to note here. One is, you see, this is very noisy. That's not because the experiment was worse, it's because the signal to noise is very low. And it shouldn't have been. The participation fraction here is less than 0.1%. So somehow a lot of nuclei are quenched in these films. And more interesting, and perhaps also related, their lifetime is about 4 times shorter in these films. We can also look at this on magnesium fluoride. It works, it's basically the same. It's a little bit better because magnesium fluoride doesn't radioluminesce very much, and so it's just a cleaner system. And this is super exciting, I think, because for a very, very long time, humans have known how to make thorium fluoride do stuff. It used to be a standard optics coating. And the people are like, well, it's kind of radioactive, so we should stop with the uranium, dinnerware and the thorium oxide coatings, thorium fluoride coatings. But this is a review article about how to do films written in 1968, right? Like, so it's been around for a while. You can do a lot with this. And so you start to dream. Like, you can make waveguides of thorium fluoride. You're going to be able to control the density of states, do all kinds of cool super radiant stuff, like build clocks where you extract, the signal the way you want. You could make like a Bragg cavity and put thorium in there. I think these are going to lead to all kinds of crazy things. They're going to be sensitive to strain, how crystalline the thing is. They're going to be sensitive to temperature. So we're going to get a frequency measurement that will tell us like the force on something, I think, or the temperature that it's at. And also, right now, there's only about 40 grams in the world of thorium-229 that is sort of accessible to us. So we want to not waste a lot of it. And these thin films require very, very microscopic amounts. So I think this is going to be important to go for. So this paper is on the archive, and it should appear in a couple of weeks. All right. There's one mystery I want to throw up in case everybody thinks about such things. So this is our experiment. This was the thorium fluoride, this was the substrate. We put a detector here to collect photons. What I didn't tell you is we also have a detector over here. And so you can ask, do they see the same number of photons? And they don't. The substrate side sees about double the number of photons that the vacuum side sees, even though substrate is like a little bit absorbed. Right? Sapphire and mag fluoride, it's about the same. Now, when I first saw this, I said, yeah, okay, that makes perfect sense. Because if I think about a photon going out, this thin film is like less than the wavelength of the light. So if a photon looks out to the substrate size, it sees an increased density of states because this has some index of refraction, and over here, n is equal to 1. So you should get this asymmetry. And I did some cubing some ratios of n's and said, this is about right. But Andre, who is a properly trained Russian physicist, said, no, we must calculate. And so he did a real good calculation of quantizing the field under these super annoying boundary conditions and said, this just doesn't make sense. We can't explain it. We see some, these numbers don't really matter, but we can't explain this. And we've been trying very hard. So if you have ideas about that, I'd love to talk about it. All right. So I see Nick's getting nervous, so I will, okay. I thought you were looking at your clock. Okay. I'll try to wrap it up. Your clock. Okay. All right. So this is a great segment of this slide. Is this the clock? This looks very portable, right? So what I didn't say here is this crystal, I don't see this crystal replacing laboratory scale clocks. Right? It's not going to replace ion clocks or neutral atom clocks because the crystal cares about things like the electric field gradient of the nuclei. And as you change the temperature of the crystal expands, and so the electric field gradient changes. There's also an overlap of the electronic wave functions with the nucleus that lead to what people call a chemical shift or a night shift and NMR. And so the nuclear frequency is going to be temperature dependent. And if you use the best thermometers we have in terms of accuracy, it probably means you can build something that it's going to outperform the cesium standard, the current definition of time, but it's not going to outperform until thermometers advance. Or we have some other ideas, which we're working on, what you could do with, like a neutral atom or ion clock. But that's okay, because we really need, the portable clocks that exist in the world don't come close to the cesium standard. So if we had portable clocks that perform at that level, it would be a big help. So this looks great, but the laser that it takes to run this, in our case, is like the size of an optical table and requires a small power plant to run. So this is not very portable. So how do we address this need? So we're looking at a number of things, but one that's really fun, I just want to tell you about, because I think it's super cute. There's a question that says, well, now that you know the wavelength, let's look at what nonlinear optics tells us. if you look through the zoo of materials out there, there's 3 or 4, probably 3, that you could use to maybe make light at 148 nanometers we need. One of the most promising right now is probably barium magnesium fluoride. And so you can imagine, like you take some barium magnesium fluoride, you need to periodically pull it, it's quasi-phase match, but you can then take 296 nanometers, double it, and then interrogate this, right? Okay, that sounds great. But here's where it gets kind of fun. Why do I have to have a separate crystal? Why can't I just dope the thorium straight into the nonlinear optical crystal? Now, if I do that, I got to make sure that like I don't mess up the electronic degrees of freedom of the crystal. And so Harry's done the calculations, and from what we understand so far about quenching, this looks like it should work. And this has a really exciting advantage because I no longer need vacuum. Right? The VUV light is generated inside the crystal. All I need is a 296 nanometer laser and a crystal. And if you know that, if you work in the field and you know the difference in making this and this is insane. I mean, this is like some fiber laser, double it, like put it in a box and you're done. So this is, I think, really exciting because this is, I think, how you can build this portable clock. So this is one of the things we're also working on. All right, so let me end there. I hope I gave a fair justice to the how we got here from the original work of Kroger and Reich. Told you about, after all these years, using the laser to excite a nucleus, and then sort of things we're thinking about now with thin films and nonlinear optics, and happy to take questions. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Eric, for a very interesting talk. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, so I have a question particularly about your statement on the uniqueness of the like the ground state doublet, the uniqueness of the ground state doublet of the thorium-229. Is there any message that maybe I missed this, but is there anything message from the mean field Nelson model that tells us particularly about the nucleus?
So I mean, like, I don't remember how you invert that. So what you can do is, so the Nelson model, if you know about it, like there's this deformation parameter that tells you basically how deformed the nucleus is. And so you can just solve it in general and plot the energy levels versus deformation. And what you'll see is that these two bands cross at some deformation of about 0.2, let's say. And that is the deformation of the thorium-229 nucleus. But that's almost like a tautology. It's not like it's not really a convection. It's just like this thing is close together, and therefore that's its deformation parameter. So I mean, okay, not let me speak for nuclear physics because I've read Dick Haston's book, and that is my exposure to nuclear physics. So there's probably a lot more to be said there. That's from what I know.
Thank you. I guess my follow-up will be: do you see this kind of crossing for any other nucleus?
No, I mean, because their deformations are different. I mean, so there are ones that are close. So the next lowest nucleus is uranium-235. It has an excited state at 76 eV. That one, I think, is useless because the rate of lifetime is like the age of the universe. So I don't know how you ever drive it. Right? It's just, you can't make something narrow enough to drive it. And then beyond that, it's like a KEV. Yeah. Yeah. So in case it helps, in the last couple of weeks, I've talked to a few nuclear theorists, and their answer is it's just magic.
What is there only 5 grams of this material, like
40 grams?
40 grams?
Yeah, so we're in between a rock and a hard place. And that is, the rock is this, you have to have weapons grade uranium to get it. And the hard place is it decays into an isotope that treats cancer. So you're between nuclear weapons and medicine, which is not a good place to be. So if you have this, you want to treat cancer. If you have the thing that makes it, you want to make bombs. So there's about 40 grams that we can get. There are kilograms of it around. And so in principle, this isn't a problem, but it will require presumably some political movement because stuff will have to be dug up. And that's currently not legal in the US.
So in light of the fact that there's so limited amount, this participation number that you
Yeah,
alluded to, that seems like a very important material science question.
yes.
So what's the underlying reason why one-year crystals at such a low participation?
Yeah, so we've been working very hard on this problem of what is this quenching mechanism? You know, my suspicion is that it's hyperfine mediated nuclear electron interaction. And it's probably very sensitive to the electron density of states, like of these defects nearby. My guess is that, and goes against what the DFT says, but my guess is that these defects are in such a place that if you grow a crystal in the thermodynamic minimum, at least for hours, and the other crystal that's been used, the participation fraction should be 100%. But you can have configurations when you dope in that aren't the thermodynamic minimum. And I think you can also have photorefractive damage that probably changes that density of states and probably quenches it. And the crystal that has the 1%, you know what, I'm maybe not being fair to him because he's seen the most abuse, right? For years, he's been hit with every color of UV light. He was at a synchrotron. And if you look at it, you can almost convince yourself it looks slightly yellow when next to another one. Like it's,
If it wasn't exposed to like just the radiation damage itself would deteriorate, and then does it the drop in time?
so I think it can. So the other guys, the PPB Vienna collaboration, their crystals, they have to cool them. Otherwise, they damage really quickly. I don't know if that's a calcium fluoride problem. We stayed away from calcium fluoride in the beginning because it's a scintillator. People use it as a scintillator detector. We thought that was not a good idea to put radioactive stuff in that we will see photons from. I don't know if it's because of that. Their doping density is higher than ours. So I don't know if that's accelerating things, but we've had crystals for 3-4 years and they're fine. So far.
These things are doped by ion implantation.
No, it's grown like from a melt. So we sprinkle it in. And I really try to make like a single crystal, everything at the thermodynamic minimum. But yeah, I mean, we're trying to build the theory of this now and be happy to talk with anyone who knows about such things, because there's a lot of questions we have in terms of that we think we're understanding, but I imagine someone somewhere knows more about this.
Yeah, I was also curious about the participation number, and I was curious if any of the anything you've learned from setting that question is applied to this kind of portable clock model, and what kind of guarantees do you have that participation number or participation of
like this is a field where we have a sample size of 2, actually 3 now with our thorium fluoride, right? So there are no guarantees. What I can say is, you know, our good crystals, the participation fraction is about 1/2 at least. And they are 4 or 5 years old. So yeah, it's something we're working on now to try to understand. It's pretty fun. Because it's been pushing the DFT in a place it doesn't want to go, because we have to understand what are the electron densities near the nucleus, right? We also have to think about things which I would call Frank-Condon factor, but when I said this to the DFT people, they have never considered that the crystal moves upon excitation. And so yeah, we're pushing. It's pretty fun because we're pushing it in a regime that hasn't been. But we'll see.
You mentioned this. Is it electric dipole transition?
It's a magnetic dipole. Yeah, I didn't actually say it. I did say it super quickly. I didn't really say it. Yeah. And so it's M1 E2, but it's mostly M1. Yeah.
Is it some? Can you use it to test some fundamental physics?
So the fundamental physics that I have thought the most about, and was the original motivation for getting into this, was looking for the variation of the fundamental constants. Because if you think about an atom and say alpha changes, by a part in 10 to the 18, then the energy changes by a part in 10 to the 18, and that's like an EV. But here we have this accidental cancellation of terms that are like GeV to MEV. And so if the constant changes, this is moving on top of a GeV, MEV, not AeV. And so this nucleus should be, people argue about the sensitivity because the nuclear models aren't good enough to really say it cares about alpha this much or some QCD parameters this much. But generically, you expect 1,000 to 100,000 times more sensitivity. So for me, as an experimentalist, I want to measure this transition really well and then do it a few years later. And if you get the same answer, then within my lifetime, I don't think anyone will ever do better on knowing if the constants are constant or not. So that's the thing I'm excited about.
So I was wondering, do you now understand the smaller peak, the redshifted peak to be due to these hyperfine radiated?
Oh, the not the redshift, but the faster peak, the one that the thing I showed earlier said, is this quenching?
Yeah.
Not really. I mean, it's still the same, like it's there. We believe this could be doing it, but there's no smoking gun.
So you still see it in this.
Yeah, it's like a big background, or it's not a big background, it's a little flat background on top of it is a super narrow thing. So it could be that. Maybe it's just impurities. I don't know, but it's not in the 232 crystal.
So usually, when there's punching, there should also be like a shift. So.
Well, but it's super broad because if you're interacting with phonons, it just like things just go crazy. Yeah, so this thing is much broader than this. So I don't even know how you could talk about a shift. You know what I mean? Like on that plot, like this thing is shooting up and this transition's like a delta function somewhere.
So for measuring the fundamental time variation of the fundamental constant, you think you're using crystal because
I mean, I think at first that will be the easiest. So David Librant, who used to run the ion clock group at NIST, he moved to UCLA like a year and a half ago. And right next door to this, he's setting up a thorium ion clock experiment. So that's our plan there. I mean, the best way to do it will be an ion clock for sure.
We have a hand raised on Zoom. Wesley Brand. Can we hear you?
Hey, can you hear me?
Wow.
All right. So to build a clock, you'll need to lock a laser to that transition. That requires an error signal. But because of the long state lifetime, the bandwidth would be really low from just fluorescence. And because the transition is like nearly 2-level, there aren't repump states available like a lattice or ion clock. What options are there to get an error signal? Something like spectroscopy on the nearly degenerate ground states, or something like dichroic atomic vapor locking?
Yeah, okay. So how do you do this? How do you build a clock given that the lifetime is so long? This is a great question and something we're worrying a lot about. On one level, you can do absorption, actually, it turns out, and get an optical depth greater than 1. So that might be an easier way to do it. We are thinking about ways of doing optical pumping to quench the nuclei a little bit faster than you might expect. And then other people are thinking about basically doing NMR on the crystal to read out the nuclear states as you excite them. And you see the hyperfine structures change. But that's a really good question.
Well, let's thank our speaker again.